It was 6:17 in the morning when Richard Hall noticed the sound of running water outside his bedroom window. He hadn't called the landscaper, and no one else was supposed to be on the grounds. Pulling back the curtain, he saw a man barefoot on the lawn, his clothes weathered, his hands gently adjusting the water flow from the hose. It was him again. 6 months earlier, Richard had found the same man curled up on a bench outside the gates of his estate, filthy, silent, eyes vacant. On a strange impulse that made no sense even to him, Richard had offered the man a job, a simple job: water the garden, stay quiet, cause no trouble. The man had nodded without a word. Now that same man moved through the yard with a grace that unsettled Richard. He trimmed with precision. He rearranged plants with instinct. It wasn't random, it was art. Richard had given him shelter, maybe out of guilt, but what he didn't know then was that the man wasn't who he claimed to be. And in just a few days, a discovery would force Richard to question everything he thought he knew about this man and about himself. Before we uncover the truth behind David's mysterious past, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon. These are real stories that few dare to tell, raw, human, unforgettable. Join a community that sees beyond the surface. Don't miss what happens next. It's not what you think. Richard Hall had everything most people spent a lifetime chasing: wealth, a sprawling estate in upstate New York, and the kind of reputation that earned him cautious respect in every room he entered. But behind the polished exterior and tailored suits was a man who had spent his life building walls, not homes. He grew up the only child of a father who saw emotions as weakness and a mother who disappeared without a word when he was just 8. From an early age, Richard learned that control was survival. Feel nothing, need no one. That mindset had made him a fortune in the finance world, but left his personal life in ruins. 2 divorces, no children, and a silence that echoed through his mansion every night. Richard wasn't cruel. He donated to charities, paid his staff generously, and never missed a board meeting. But connection, vulnerability, those were foreign languages to him. That's why, when he first saw the man sleeping outside his gate, he almost walked past him, almost. Something about the man's stillness, his lack of desperation, made Richard pause. Without thinking, he offered him a meal, then a shower, then a job. The man said his name was David. No last name, no questions asked. David was unlike anyone Richard had ever employed. He didn't talk much, didn't pry, and never complained. He arrived early, worked late, and treated the garden as if it were sacred ground. Every morning, Richard would catch glimpses of him pruning the roses or repositioning stones around the koi pond with meticulous care. At first, Richard dismissed it as gratitude. Just a homeless man thankful for a second chance. But something about David's movements, the way he observed the plants before touching them, began to unsettle him. It wasn't just skill, it was knowledge, depth, purpose. Still, Richard kept his distance. The rules were simple: do your work, stay out of the house, and keep to the guest quarters. No need to get personal. But the lines were already beginning to blur, and Richard, who had spent his entire life avoiding entanglement, was slowly being drawn into a mystery he didn't realize he'd invited onto his property. For Richard, offering David a job wasn't an act of heroism. It was about control. The world, in his eyes, was full of messy, broken people, and the best way to stay above it all was to keep everything and everyone predictable. Giving a homeless man work felt like restoring order, placing a stray piece back where it belonged. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't want it. What he wanted was to feel like he hadn't ignored the suffering outside his gates. But David didn't behave the way Richard expected. He didn't act desperate. He didn't ask for anything more. He worked in silence, always calm, always present, and that ironically made Richard pay attention. At first, David's duties were basic: water the garden, pull weeds, keep the grounds clean. But in just a few weeks, the place began to change. Flowers that hadn't bloomed in years came to life. Vines that were once overgrown were artfully trimmed into graceful curves. The property began to feel cared for, not just maintained. Richard noticed. He started walking the garden in the evenings, pretending to be on the phone, but really just watching. David never looked up, but his hands, his choices, the way he moved among the plants, it was as if he knew their stories. One morning, Richard asked, almost against his own will, "Did you study horticulture or something?" David paused, then smiled faintly. Something like that. That was all he said. From that point on, Richard gave him more freedom. David began redesigning parts of the yard on his own. He built a small herb garden near the kitchen, installed a trellis covered in jasmine by the guest house. The household staff started whispering about him, curious, suspicious, but also impressed. Edward Barnes, the estate's longtime butler, was not impressed. He had served the Hall family for over 20 years and took pride in order, hierarchy, and loyalty. To him, David was a disruption, a man with no history, no references, no background check. He started dropping comments around the staff. "Funny how fast someone can rise when no one knows where they've been." Richard ignored it. He didn't want to admit it, but he enjoyed the change. The garden felt alive again, and with it something inside him softened. For the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of his own loneliness. And though he'd never say it out loud, a small, quiet part of him began to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something good. But good intentions, no matter how well planted, can't stop a storm when it's already on the horizon. It was a Thursday morning when the first accusation surfaced. Richard had just returned from a business trip when Edward met him at the front door, arms crossed, his expression stiffer than usual. "The silver pruning shears are missing. The ones imported from Japan. I checked everywhere. Only one person's been in the garden." Richard blinked. "You're saying David stole them?" Edward didn't nod, but his silence spoke loud enough. Richard wanted to dismiss it immediately, but a knot formed in his stomach. He didn't know David, not really, and that uncertainty, small as it was, gnawed at him. Later that afternoon he confronted David by the shed. The man was kneeling in the soil, planting marigolds. "David," Richard began, voice tight, "the shears, they're gone, the expensive ones. Did you take them?" David stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. His eyes didn't flinch. "No, sir. I haven't touched them." Richard hesitated, but the old instinct kicked in, the part of him that had learned long ago not to trust too easily. "I think it's best if you leave, for now." David didn't argue. He didn't even ask why. He just nodded, walked to the guest house, collected a single bag, and left through the side gate without a word. By evening, guilt started to settle over Richard like dusk. He went to the tool shed to look again, this time methodically, and there, in the back corner behind a stack of unused flower pots, were the shears, untouched, gleaming under a ray of fading sunlight. A mistake, a stupid, irreparable mistake. He called Edward immediately. They were never stolen. They were misplaced. Edward only said, "That doesn't change where he came from." But it did change something for Richard. The garden looked different the next morning. The vines hung heavier, the flowers drooped slightly, as if they too noticed the absence of the man who had brought them back to life. Richard stood in the middle of it all, feeling more exposed than he had in years. He had pushed someone away, not because he had proof, but because fear whispered louder than truth. And the man didn't even fight back. No pleading, no explanation, just silence. It was the silence that haunted him most. He'd given David a second chance, but what if David had been giving him one too? The days after David's departure passed with a strange emptiness. The garden, once full of rhythm and silent conversation, now felt foreign. The jasmine trellis began to wither. The herbs turned dry and brittle. Even the koi in the pond seemed less vibrant. Their graceful movements slowed, as if they too sensed the change. Richard tried to ignore it. He threw himself into work, booked unnecessary meetings, traveled when he didn't need to. But wherever he went, something followed him. An image, a question, an ache he couldn't name. One evening after returning from a gala, he found himself wandering the garden under a half-moon. The flowers had lost their symmetry, the soil was dry, the balance was gone. He stood in front of the marigolds, the last thing David had planted. They were still holding on, but barely. Without thinking, Richard dropped to his knees and began pulling weeds with his bare hands. The soil crumbled between his fingers. He had no idea what he was doing, no plan, but he couldn't bear the silence anymore. He remembered David's face when he was accused. No anger, no disappointment, just stillness, as if he had expected it all along. Why hadn't he defended himself? Richard went inside and opened a bottle of wine. He drank alone, staring at the guest house door across the yard, still closed, still untouched. He hated that it bothered him this much. The next day, in a rare moment of vulnerability, Richard asked Rachel, his young assistant, if she knew how to contact David. She hesitated. "I don't, but he left this behind." She handed Richard a notebook. The cover was plain, worn from use. Inside were notes in delicate handwriting, sketches of plants, planting schedules, observations. But scattered between the gardening pages were poems. Honest, raw, aching poems. One ended with the line, "When everything I knew was taken, I learned how to grow again." Richard felt something shift in his chest, a fracture, a question. Who was this man, really? Later that week, he drove to the public library in town. Margaret, the elderly librarian, remembered David immediately. "David Carter," she said. "He used to come here every week. He was a professor once. Botany, I think. Taught at NYU. Brilliant. Disappeared after his wife died in a car crash. Just vanished." Richard stood frozen. "Are you sure it's the same man?" She pulled out an old article. There was a photo. David, younger, cleaner shaven, but unmistakably him. The headline read, "Acclaimed botanist David Carter leaves academia after personal tragedy." Richard's heart dropped. He had fired a man with more knowledge in his fingertips than most people gained in a lifetime. He had doubted someone who had once been trusted to teach others. And worse, he had judged a man not by his choices, but by his losses. The revelation hit him harder than he expected. He sat in his car for nearly an hour before driving home. Back at the estate, the silence returned. But now, it wasn't empty. It was full of regret. He walked into the garden once more and stood among the wilting flowers. "I didn't just lose a gardener," he whispered to no one. "I lost someone I was supposed to see." And for the first time in years, Richard Hall cried. Not out of anger, not out of guilt, but out of shame. If this story is stirring something in you, if it reminds you of someone or maybe even yourself, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Sometimes reflection begins not with answers, but with honest questions. Let's grow through this, together. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in the garden until sunrise, notebook still in his hands, rereading the same lines over and over. "When everything I knew was taken, I learned how to grow again." It wasn't just poetry, it was survival in ink. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling outcomes, this, grief, regret, helplessness, was unfamiliar territory. But David's story had cracked something open in him. For once, Richard wasn't looking for a solution. He was looking for a way to understand. He started researching everything he could find about David Carter. Academic journals, archived lectures, even interviews. The man had been a giant in his field, a respected mind in botanical science, known not only for his knowledge, but for his ability to make complex concepts feel like poetry. One article described him as the professor who could make a flower seem like a revolution. But then came the tragedy, a drunk driver, a late-night phone call, the death of David's wife. And just like that, he vanished from the world. No resignation letter, no public statement, just silence. Richard couldn't stop thinking. How many people had passed him on the street, never knowing who he was? How many times had he done the same? The question that followed was more difficult. Why had David accepted his job offer in the first place? He didn't need the money. He wasn't chasing recognition. Maybe he just wanted to feel useful again. Or maybe he was waiting for someone to see past the dirt and the silence. And Richard hadn't, but he could now. That afternoon he made calls. Quiet, personal ones. No staff, no intermediaries. He reached out to a local community center that helped with outreach to homeless individuals. He asked Rachel to help locate shelters and contacts. No fanfare. Just one goal. Find David. 4 days passed before they got a lead. A man matching his description had been seen helping out at a church garden on the outskirts of the city. Richard drove there himself. He found David behind the chapel, kneeling beside a row of tomatoes, sleeves rolled up, dirt under his nails. He looked thinner, older, but still his hands moved with that same quiet intention. David looked up, surprised but calm. "I found your shears," Richard said softly. David gave a small nod. "I figured." There was a long pause. "I didn't come here to fix anything," Richard continued. "Just to say I see you now, and I'm sorry I didn't before." For the first time, David met his eyes fully. "That's more than most," he said. They sat on a wooden bench beside the garden at the church. No more than 10 feet away, a group of volunteers was laying mulch and transplanting seedlings. Richard watched David watch them, quietly, almost like a conductor listening to a symphony he once led. "I have an idea," Richard said. David didn't speak, but his body turned slightly, listening. "I want to start something that matters. A community garden project, real spaces in real neighborhoods, teaching people how to grow food, how to connect. You'd lead it." David let out a slow breath. "Why me?" "Because I don't know a damn thing about plants," Richard answered. "But I know when someone brings life into dead places." David chuckled faintly at that. "You think people will listen to a man who disappeared?" "I think they'll listen to someone who came back," Richard said. David didn't give an answer that day, but 3 days later he showed up at Richard's estate. Same worn bag, same quiet steps. He didn't ask for keys or a contract or a salary. He asked where they would start. They chose a lot in a forgotten part of the city. Trash strewn, neglected, bordered by a rusted chain-link fence. It was perfect. The first week was slow. They cleared debris, dug trenches, pulled weeds that seemed older than the buildings around them. David moved methodically, instructing Richard without ever raising his voice. For every tool he explained its purpose. For every plant, a story. "Tomatoes grow better when you talk to them," he said once, not looking up. "It's not about words, it's about attention." Richard didn't argue. He listened. For the first time, he was the student. Rachel joined them after hours. So did a few teenagers from the neighborhood. Then a mother and her son. No one was paid. No one asked who was in charge. They simply came. David had a way of making space feel safe, even sacred. At night, Richard went home sore, his hands blistered, his clothes ruined. But his mind was lighter. He realized, in those quiet, dirt-covered afternoons, that success had never really filled him. This connection, purpose, humility, this was something different. It didn't shine like gold, but it rooted like truth. And for the first time in decades, Richard Hall slept through the night without needing a drink. Momentum was building. By the 3rd month, the garden had transformed. What once was concrete and chaos was now rows of thriving greens, vibrant flowers, and laughter echoing off nearby walls. The project, unofficially dubbed Second Soil, drew attention from local schools, non-profits, and even a journalist or two. But with growth came pressure and resistance. David, though admired by the volunteers, remained distant. He refused interviews, declined speaking engagements. When Rachel suggested a small local feature story, his answer was sharp. "This isn't about me." But Richard noticed more than just his reluctance. There were days David didn't show up. Days when he'd arrive late, shadows under his eyes, hands shaking slightly. One afternoon, Richard found him alone in the shed, staring at nothing, his palms pressed to his knees like he was trying to stay grounded. "Talk to me," Richard said gently. David shook his head. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. Memories, guilt, and decades of buried grief don't vanish with a garden, and some nights the silence was still too loud for him to bear. Then came the encounter. During a visit to a local botanical society, David spotted a former colleague, someone from his university days. The man didn't recognize him at first, but when he did, his reaction was dismissive. "David Carter. God, I thought you were dead," he laughed. "Now you're planting tomatoes in the hood. What a fall." David didn't respond. He simply walked out, leaving Richard to follow. In the car, David stared out the window, jaw clenched. "He's not wrong," he muttered. "I was someone. Now I'm just a ghost with dirty hands." Richard didn't know what to say at first, but then he remembered something David had told him weeks earlier about how plants need to break through the soil in darkness before reaching the light. "You're not a ghost," Richard said. "You're the seed that survived the fire." David didn't reply. But the next morning, he was back in the garden. Still, there were relapses. Days when David disappeared without warning, returning with red-rimmed eyes and a heavy silence. But he always came back. He always worked, and Richard stayed beside him, sometimes with words, sometimes with quiet, because healing doesn't move in straight lines. It circles, it collapses, it rises again. And the garden, like the men who tended it, was learning to grow in imperfect soil. The invitation came from the city council. They had heard of the success of Second Soil, how it revitalized not just a barren lot, but a fractured community. They wanted someone to speak at the upcoming Civic Engagement Summit. Rachel brought the email to Richard and David one morning as they were planting kale. "They want you to talk," she said, looking at David. "Tell the story. Inspire others." David stiffened, eyes fixed on the soil. "I'm not a speaker anymore." "You don't have to be," Richard replied. "Just be honest." David said nothing for a long time, then finally, "I'll think about it." The night before the event, Richard found him sitting alone by the jasmine trellis. The scent was heavy in the air. "I haven't stood in front of a crowd since before the accident," David said quietly. "Back then, I used to feel certain, like I knew what I was offering." "You still do," Richard replied. "You just don't see it yet." The next morning, the auditorium was packed. Politicians, educators, community leaders, all waiting for someone to explain how a forgotten patch of land had become a beacon of hope. David stood backstage, heart racing, palms clammy. The organizer called his name. He stepped out slowly. There was no PowerPoint, no script, just a podium, a microphone, and hundreds of eyes. He began simply, "I used to be a professor. I taught botany, spoke at conferences, wrote papers people actually read." Polite laughter. "Then one night my wife, my best friend, was killed by a drunk driver, and I stopped speaking, I stopped showing up to life. I disappeared." Silence. "For years I wandered, not just through streets, but through grief, shame, isolation. And one day, a man I didn't know gave me a job, expecting nothing but silence in return." He looked at Richard in the front row. "I took it, not because I needed money, but because I needed something to grow again." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "We think of gardens as quiet places, but they're not. They're loud with life. They require care, patience, mess, and so do people." Now the room was still, hanging on every word. "I didn't heal by escaping the world. I healed by digging into it, with others, in the dirt, day by day." He stepped back from the mic, and the room stood. A standing ovation, not for a scientist or a professor, but for a man who found his voice again in the most unlikely of places. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand. A young teacher asked for advice on starting a school garden. An older woman said his story reminded her of her late husband. Backstage, Richard waited with a smile. "You killed it," he said. David laughed, tears in his eyes. "I didn't even finish half of what I wanted to say." "You said exactly what they needed." That night, they returned to the garden. The moonlight made the leaves shimmer. The jasmine had started climbing higher than ever. David walked to the marigolds, the same ones he'd planted months ago, still standing, still burning orange. "I think," he said softly, "I'm ready to stop surviving." Richard didn't ask what that meant. He just nodded, because some moments don't need explanation. They just need to be witnessed. In the months that followed the summit, the story of Second Soil spread far beyond the city. But more important than the media attention was the quiet ripple it created. Small community gardens sprouting in unexpected corners, old lots reclaimed by neighbors, strangers becoming caretakers of shared spaces. And through it all, Richard often found himself thinking not about the success, but about the lesson David had unknowingly given him. He used to believe power came from protection, guarding your assets, your image, your emotions. But watching David rise from ruin, watching him turn loss into growth, taught him something deeper. True strength is rooted in vulnerability, in choosing to show up even when nothing is guaranteed, in offering your hands to the soil without knowing what will bloom. Richard had spent most of his life calculating risk, but it was the uncalculated decision, the moment he stopped and saw a man on a bench, that changed everything. It wasn't charity that built Second Soil. It was dignity, trust, space. And it reminded him, and everyone who watched, that we often overlook the most powerful among us simply because they no longer look powerful. But inside them, waiting patiently, are entire gardens we haven't yet learned to see. David Carter never returned to academia. He never published another research paper, never stepped back into a lecture hall under fluorescent lights. But in community centers, schoolyards, and empty city lots, he became a teacher once again, just not in the way he had been before. People came to him not for theory, but for guidance, for stillness, for the way he listened before offering advice, and the way his hands moved with patience, as if every leaf deserved his full attention. He helped build gardens across 5 neighborhoods, taught formerly incarcerated men how to grow vegetables from scratch, sat with children as they watched seeds sprout for the first time. He didn't need recognition. He needed roots. Richard, meanwhile, transformed his role too. He stepped back from the world of boardrooms and investment deals and redirected his fortune into what he called legacy soil, projects that outlived profit margins. He and David remained close, partners not in business, but in purpose. Their friendship wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in shared silence, in sweat-soaked afternoons turning earth, in the long, unspoken understanding between 2 men who had once been strangers, until life, grief, and choice made them brothers in redemption. And the garden kept growing. How many people have we passed by, never knowing the storms they've survived? David Carter wasn't just a man who lost everything. He was a man who chose to start again, in silence, with his hands in the dirt. And Richard Hall wasn't just a millionaire. He was a man brave enough to admit he'd been blind and humble enough to change. Maybe that's the real power of this story, not the garden they built, but the roots they grew in each other. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever judged someone before knowing their story? Have you ever been given a second chance, or given one to someone else? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters here. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect, if it stirred something in your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, with someone who needs to believe that transformation is still possible. And most of all, don't forget to subscribe to The Weight of Choice for more real stories that remind us one decision, one moment of compassion can change everything. Because sometimes redemption starts with a simple act of seeing someone,